Have you ever made a decision that seemed like the best choice at the time, only to realize later that it was the worst mistake of your life? Christopher Hayes, a cold and calculating millionaire, was used to treating everything as an investment, including the animals he owned. To him, a horse was just a number, a machine for profit. And when Thunder, his most valuable thoroughbred, suffered an accident, Christopher didn't think twice before discarding him on the side of a deserted road. What he never expected was that this mistake would come back to haunt him in the worst possible way. Because Thunder didn't just survive, he found someone willing to prove that he was still worth fighting for. And now, Christopher will have to face the consequences of the worst decision he has ever made. The racetrack was slick with the drizzle that had been falling since dawn. The sky, once blue and imposing, was now covered by heavy clouds, making the atmosphere even more tense. At the Kentucky Jockey Club, elite racehorses were preparing for another competition, and among them was Thunder, a majestic thoroughbred, his muscles perfectly sculpted, his intense gaze radiating strength and determination. From the grandstand, Christopher Hayes watched with his usual calculating expression. His impeccable suit contrasted sharply with the muddy racetrack, and his cold eyes were fixed solely on the prize. To him, Thunder wasn't a living being with a soul and emotions, he was just an expensive investment that needed to bring a return. The starting gates burst open. A distant rumble of thunder echoed across the sky, and the horses shot forward like arrows across the drenched field. Thunder, as always, led the race, his powerful strides widening the gap between him and the other competitors. But then, everything changed in the blink of an eye. Another clap of thunder roared, closer this time. For a mere fraction of a second, Thunder hesitated, an instinctive reaction to the sudden sound. His hoofs slipped in the mud, and the weight of his powerful body turned against him. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the horse crashed to the ground, rolling violently across the track. The impact was brutal. Dust and mud flew into the air as the other horses veered to avoid a collision. Thunder lay motionless for a moment, his flanks rising and falling rapidly, his breath ragged and strained. His eyes, once burning with energy, now blinked through the searing pain spreading through his body. Christopher clenched his fists as he watched the scene unfold, not out of concern for the horse, but for the money slipping through his fingers. The racetrack veterinarians rushed onto the field to assess Thunder's injuries. After a quick examination of his hind leg, they exchanged worried glances. One of them approached Christopher and explained that Thunder would require a long rehabilitation period. With luck, he might recover, but there was a significant chance he would never race again. Christopher exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. His gaze swept over the injured horse, covered in mud and streaked with blood. In his world, there was no room for useless animals. Without a shred of emotion, he gave a slight nod. The meaning was clear to the trainers and veterinarians: Thunder was no longer worth the investment. They could do whatever they wanted with him, he didn't care. The coldness in his demeanor made even the handlers shudder. The vet hesitated, as if expecting him to reconsider, but Christopher had already made his decision. Without another glance, he turned and strode toward his limousine, disappearing into the night. That same evening, Thunder was transported far from the city. Under the steady drizzle, a truck came to a stop on a deserted road, surrounded by gnarled trees and the impenetrable darkness of the early morning. Two men stepped out of the cab, opened the back of the vehicle, and tugged at the ropes holding the injured horse in place. Thunder whinnied in pain as he was forced to the ground. His legs trembled, his breathing still labored. The men, utterly indifferent, led him to the side of the road and loosened the rope that bound him. Without a second thought, they climbed back into the truck and drove away, disappearing down the empty road, leaving Thunder alone in the night. The rain intensified, and the cold seeped into his muscles, making him shiver. His dark eyes stared into the vast unknown ahead. His body ached, his leg throbbed, but deep inside, there was something that neither Christopher, nor pain, nor abandonment could extinguish: the will to live. He didn't know how, but somehow, he would survive. The night was thick with darkness, and the silence of the road was broken only by the soft patter of rain drumming against the roof of Charlotte Evans' old truck. The winding dirt road cut through a forest of gnarled trees, their shadows stretching eerily under the dim glow of streetlights scattered miles apart. Inside the vehicle, Charlotte rubbed her tired eyes. It had been a long day. The small-town veterinary clinic where she worked had been overwhelming, and all she wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and curl up under a warm blanket with a good book. But fate had other plans for her that night. Just a few yards ahead, something caught her attention, a dark, motionless figure at the edge of the road. Her heartbeat quickened. She slowed down, narrowing her eyes. Was it a deer? A stray dog? As she got closer, the silhouette became clearer under the beams of her headlights, and then, her heart leaped into her throat. It was a horse. Charlotte slammed on the brakes, and the truck groaned in protest. Her instincts took over. She pushed open the door and stepped out into the drizzle, the cold seeping through her worn-out jacket. The scent of wet earth filled the air, mingled with something else, something sharp and metallic. Thunder lay motionless, his breathing shallow, his once glistening coat now smeared with mud and wounds. Charlotte knelt beside him, her eyes locked on the magnificent creature collapsed before her. The horse lifted his head weakly, sensing her presence. His dark, expressive eyes were filled with pain, but also something else. Fear. A fear so deep it cut through Charlotte like a blade. He had already suffered enough. She knew that look. Charlotte had always had a special connection with animals. Since childhood, she had felt she could understand them in ways others could not. That bond had driven her to become a veterinarian, even though life had never been kind to her. Raised on a rundown ranch left behind by her grandparents, she had never had much. Her father had walked out when she was a child, and her mother had passed away years ago. Since then, all she had left was that small piece of land and an old barn she had turned into a shelter for abandoned animals. She knew what it was like to be discarded. And looking at Thunder now, she saw a reflection of herself. Slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves, she extended her hand. The horse flinched slightly, his ears twitching in alert. Charlotte remained still, her voice calm and steady. "Hey, buddy, it's okay," she whispered, her words nearly carried away by the biting wind. She examined his wounds, the way he kept his hind leg raised to avoid putting weight on it. The swelling was obvious, and if he didn't receive treatment soon, things could take a turn for the worse. But who could have done this? A lump formed in her throat at the thought of someone deliberately abandoning him like this, leaving him to die alone on the side of the road. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, taking a deep breath. It didn't matter who had left him here. What mattered was what she would do now. Determination ignited inside her. She hurried back to the truck, grabbed an old blanket, and returned to cover Thunder, trying to shield him from the bitter cold of the night. "I'm not leaving you here," she murmured, running a gentle hand over his neck. Charlotte knew she was about to take on a challenge far bigger than herself. She had no money, no proper setup to care for a horse like him. But looking at Thunder, the way he was beginning to trust her despite everything, she also knew there was no other choice. She would do whatever it took to save him. The darkness of night was beginning to fade as Charlotte pulled her truck up to the entrance of her ranch. The cold wind blew against her face, carrying the damp scent of freshly soaked earth. The sky was still sprinkled with stars, but on the horizon, a thin strip of orange signaled the arrival of morning. She climbed out of the truck, exhaustion weighing on her muscles. Her body ached, but her mind was sharp, preoccupied with the injured horse she was about to shelter. Thunder let out a weak snort from the truck bed. He was drained, his breathing uneven, his body trembling from cold and pain. Charlotte hurried to rig up a wooden ramp to help him down. Waiting for her was John, the old veterinarian and longtime family friend, holding a lantern in one hand and a serious expression on his face. "This isn't going to be easy, girl," he murmured, his seasoned eyes studying the horse carefully. "I know," Charlotte replied, her voice thick with concern. "But he needs us." With patience and effort, they guided Thunder into the barn. Charlotte had already prepared a space for him, soft hay, fresh water, and a quiet refuge away from the cold. The horse stumbled slightly as he took his first steps inside, his injured leg clearly in pain. But somehow, he seemed to understand he was safe now. The silence of the barn was interrupted by the distant rumble of an approaching storm. Charlotte looked at Thunder and made a silent promise: she would do whatever it took to help him. The first days were the most difficult. Thunder's injury required constant care. Charlotte followed John's instructions to the letter: herbal compresses to reduce swelling, therapeutic massages, and a special ointment for his cuts and scratches. But despite her efforts, there were moments when Thunder groaned in pain and pulled away. Her patience was tested daily. He was strong and distrustful, and earning his trust wouldn't be something that happened overnight. Time became a balancing act between hope and frustration. Some mornings, Thunder would allow her to tend to his wounds without hesitation. Other days, he recoiled, his wide eyes filled with fear, as if he still expected someone to hurt him again. Charlotte didn't blame him. She knew what it felt like to be abandoned. At night, after long shifts at the vet clinic and hours caring for Thunder, Charlotte would sit beside him in the barn. More than once, she drifted off to sleep leaning against the stall fence, her head nodding from exhaustion. And when she woke, she would find Thunder watching her. His dark eyes gleamed in the dim light, as if he were beginning to understand, she wasn't going to give up on him. Days turned into weeks. Thunder's recovery was slow but steady. Each small victory filled Charlotte with hope. The first time she saw him tentatively put weight on his injured leg, she knew they were making progress. But the challenges were far from over. The cost of medicine, feed, and supplies started to weigh heavily on her. The household bills were piling up, and extra shifts at the clinic became a necessity. The time she spent with Thunder was growing shorter, and guilt gnawed at her. "I have to find a way to fix this," she murmured to herself one rainy evening, sitting on the barn's front porch. She looked toward Thunder, who watched her in silence. "Don't worry, buddy. We'll get through this together." And deep down, she knew she couldn't give up. Thunder hadn't given up. She wouldn't either. If you've followed the story this far, give it a like, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this. The golden light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the barn, gently illuminating the straw-covered floor. The scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass lingered in the air as Charlotte leaned against the wooden fence, watching Thunder closely. The past few months had been exhausting, but every day of effort had been worth it. The horse that had once been injured and abandoned now moved confidently around the enclosure, his muscles fully recovered, the scar on his hind leg serving only as a reminder of his difficult past. Little by little, Thunder had regained his strength and vitality. But there was still something about him that intrigued Charlotte. There was an energy in his movements, a spark in his eyes that seemed to conceal something beyond mere physical recovery. During their daily exercises, Charlotte began noticing subtle details. Thunder reacted unusually to certain stimuli, his body responding with precision and speed to every new obstacle in his path. At first, it seemed like coincidence. But as the days passed, the signs became clearer. And then, it happened. On a cloudy morning, a distant thunderclap echoed across the ranch, startling the other animals. Charlotte, momentarily distracted, knocked over a bucket of feed, spilling grains across the barn floor. Before she could react, Thunder did something unexpected. With a swift movement, he leaped gracefully over the scattered feed, landing softly on the other side. Charlotte froze for a moment. The sound of the wind rustling through the leaves was the only thing breaking the silence. Her gaze remained fixed on the horse, analyzing every detail of his precise, elegant movement. She tested it again in the following days, setting up small challenges within the enclosure. And to her surprise, Thunder repeated his performance, not only dodging obstacles but effortlessly clearing them with impressive jumps. It wasn't a coincidence. Charlotte felt her heart race. The horse that had been mercilessly discarded, left to die by the roadside, possessed a rare talent. Something no one, not even Christopher, had noticed. And in that moment, she knew. Thunder wasn't just a survivor. He had a gift that could change everything. The days that followed were filled with pure exhilaration for Charlotte. She spent hours watching Thunder in the enclosure, mesmerized by the horse's natural talent. Every jump, every fluid and precise movement, was proof that he wasn't just a survivor, he was a true champion. The bond between them grew stronger with each training session. Thunder trusted her completely, responding to her commands with an astonishing sensitivity, as if he knew exactly what she wanted before she even asked. Charlotte often found herself smiling alone, marveling at the beauty of it all. As a child, she had always dreamed of working with horses, and now, standing before her, was an animal unlike any other, one with an extraordinary gift. The thought of Thunder competing one day, showing the world his true greatness, filled her with hope. But the happiness didn't last long. On a cloudy morning, as Charlotte was finishing up feeding the animals on the ranch, something made her heart pound. A sleek black luxury car rolled slowly down the dirt road before coming to a stop in front of the barn. The metallic shine of its body starkly contrasted with the simplicity of the place, and the sight sent a chill down Charlotte's spine. She knew exactly who it was before he even stepped out of the car. Christopher. The man who had abandoned Thunder without a shred of remorse was back. Charlotte's fingers instinctively tightened around the fabric of her jeans, her pulse racing. What was he doing here? What did he want after all this time? The answer hit her like a punch to the gut. Christopher wasn't there by chance. He wanted Thunder back. His presence cast a shadow of unease over Charlotte. Everything she had built with Thunder, all the effort and love she had poured into him, could be ripped away in an instant. The cold, calculating look in Christopher's eyes made it clear, he wasn't the kind of man who accepted no for an answer. Charlotte swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the battle ahead. She would fight for Thunder. But would that be enough to stop Christopher? The tension in the air was almost palpable. Charlotte stood her ground at the barn entrance, arms crossed in an attempt to hide the subtle tremor running through her body. Christopher stepped out of the car with calculated strides, adjusting the cuff of his expensive blazer, an almost automatic gesture, yet one that exuded superiority. His eyes swept across the ranch with silent disdain before settling on Thunder, who trotted carefreely inside the enclosure. His expression hardened. Without hesitation, Christopher got straight to the point. Thunder belonged to him. Charlotte felt her stomach churn. The thought of Thunder being taken back by this man, after everything they had been through together, was unbearable. He didn't want the horse out of care, nor out of regret. Christopher saw Thunder the same way he saw his business ventures, as an investment. Taking a deep breath, Charlotte kept her voice firm but controlled. She explained how Thunder had arrived at the ranch, injured and abandoned, left to fend for himself. How she had fought for his recovery, caring for him day and night when no one else would. Christopher didn't show a flicker of emotion. He simply took a step forward, a cynical smile playing on his lips. To him, none of that mattered. Thunder was his by right. He had never sold him, never officially transferred ownership, therefore, Thunder was still legally his. The coldness in his words made Charlotte's blood boil. How could someone be so heartless? How could he look at Thunder now, after all this time, and still believe he had the right to take him back? The argument escalated. Charlotte countered that by abandoning Thunder injured on the roadside, Christopher had forfeited any claim over him. If she hadn't found the horse that rainy night, he would have surely died. And now that Thunder was healthy again, now that he was showing talent and promise, Christopher suddenly reappeared to reclaim him. It was beyond unfair. Christopher, however, wasn't intimidated. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, and a young rancher wasn't going to change that. Charlotte knew words alone wouldn't convince him. But then, something unexpected happened. Thunder, who had been watching the confrontation from a distance, began to approach. His steps were firm, purposeful, as if he understood that he was at the heart of this dispute. He stopped beside Charlotte, lowering his head gently against her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but a powerful one. Charlotte raised her hand and stroked his neck, feeling the warmth and strength radiating from him. Thunder had made his choice. Christopher watched the scene, his expression unreadable. For the first time, he seemed to hesitate. Charlotte knew, at that moment, that this battle wouldn't be won with arguments alone. She needed something more, something that would definitively prove that Thunder could never belong to Christopher again. And for that, she would have to act fast. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon when Charlotte realized that arguing wouldn't be enough. She needed something undeniable to keep Thunder by her side. And then, an idea struck her. With one last look at Christopher, she took a deep breath and made her decision. If Christopher wanted Thunder back, then he had to prove that he truly knew the horse. With firm steps, Charlotte opened the gate to the enclosure and stepped inside, motioning for Christopher to follow. He hesitated for a moment but, full of confidence, accepted the challenge. Inside the enclosure, Thunder watched their every move attentively. His gaze shifted between Charlotte and Christopher, as if sensing that something was about to happen. Charlotte knew that since his recovery, Thunder had developed a special talent. He was more than just a racehorse, he had unique abilities, a keen instinct, and a deep connection with those he trusted. Turning to Christopher, she made her proposition. If Thunder truly belonged to him, then let him prove it. Let him call the horse, guide him, show that there was still a bond between them. If Thunder willingly went to him, Charlotte would have no more arguments. The silence that followed was deafening. Christopher scoffed, as if the idea was absurd. To him, a horse was just an animal trained to obey commands, not a creature capable of making choices. With arrogance, he called for Thunder. Nothing happened. The horse remained exactly where he was, unmoving, his eyes locked on Christopher but not taking a single step toward him. Christopher insisted, his voice growing more authoritative. Still, Thunder did not move. Charlotte crossed her arms, standing firm, waiting. Then, in an act of quiet defiance, Thunder did the opposite of what Christopher expected. He slowly turned and walked toward Charlotte, lowering his head gently against her, just as he had done before. It was the final answer. Christopher was speechless. His expression shifted from shock to frustration, then to something bordering on restrained anger. He opened his mouth to argue, but he realized he had no more words. Charlotte lifted her chin, her eyes meeting his with unwavering determination. Thunder had already made his choice. Christopher let out a heavy sigh, his wounded pride evident. He knew that legally, he could try to fight for Thunder, but he also knew that it would cause a scandal. He, a renowned businessman, going up against a young rancher who had clearly devoted her life to saving a horse he himself had abandoned? It wasn't worth it. With one final glance at Thunder, Christopher adjusted his suit, took a deep breath, and turned away. Without another word, he exited the enclosure and walked to his car. Charlotte watched as he drove off, an overwhelming sense of relief washing over her. As the dust settled from Christopher's tires, she turned to Thunder and smiled, running a hand down the horse's strong neck. They had won. The days that followed were peaceful for Charlotte and Thunder. For the first time since she had found the injured horse on the side of the road, she could finally breathe easy, without fear that someone would take him away. The sun rose gently over the fields, bathing the farm in golden hues. Thunder ran freely across the pasture, his mane dancing in the wind, displaying all his strength and elegance. Charlotte watched from a distance, smiling with pride and gratitude. They had faced unimaginable challenges, but together, they had overcome them all. With each passing day, Thunder seemed more confident and joyful. He was no longer the frightened, wounded horse Charlotte had found on that rainy night. Now, he was a symbol of resilience, of triumph, and, above all, of freedom. Charlotte, in turn, had changed as well. Thunder had taught her about perseverance, about fighting for what truly matters. He wasn't just a rescued horse, he was her friend, her inspiration, a being who had touched her life in a way she never could have imagined. She knew the future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: as long as they were together, nothing was impossible. Sometimes, second chances come when we least expect them. For Thunder, it was the moment Charlotte decided he was worth fighting for. For Charlotte, it was the realization that this horse didn't just need her, he would also teach her invaluable lessons about courage and love. Stories like this remind us that while we can't always change the past, we always have the power to shape the future. And maybe, just maybe, true strength isn't about winning races, but about finding someone who will never give up on you. If you've followed the story this far, give it a like, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this.